Officer Sarah Winters had seen plenty of unusual calls in her years on patrol, but when dispatch reported a wild animal blocking traffic on Highway 83, she felt a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't every day that a bobcat decided to take a stand in the middle of the road. Expecting a quick and simple resolution, she activated her lights and sirens, weaving through the stalled cars until she reached the reported location. As she stepped out of her patrol car, the sight before her was both striking and puzzling. A young bobcat stood defiantly in the center of the road, its tawny fur and dark spots nearly camouflaging against the cracked asphalt. The animal's body was tense, its muscles coiled as if preparing to spring into action. But it didn't run. It didn't even flinch when a car's horn blared angrily a few feet away. Instead, it remained rooted to the spot, its sharp amber eyes fixed on something beyond the line of trees at the edge of the highway. Sarah's hand hovered near her radio. Was the animal injured? Sick? She had encountered wildlife before, deer frozen in headlights, raccoons scurrying through alleys, but this was different. There was no panic in the bobcat's posture, no fear. It wasn't confused or disoriented. If anything, it seemed determined. Almost as if it had a purpose. She took a cautious step forward, her boots crunching against the gravel. The bobcat's ears twitched in response, but it didn't retreat. Sarah's pulse quickened. Most wild animals fled at the first sign of humans, but this one was standing its ground. That was enough to make her uneasy. Something wasn't right. Her fingers tightened around the radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Winters. I have eyes on the bobcat. It's not behaving normally. Send animal control, but, she hesitated, watching as the bobcat took a slow, deliberate step toward the tree line. I think there's something else going on here. She didn't know why, but an inexplicable instinct told her this animal wasn't just lost. It was trying to lead her somewhere. Officer Sarah Winters kept a close eye on the bobcat as it remained near the edge of the road, its golden eyes flickering between her and the dense forest beyond. Something about its posture, tense, alert, almost urgent, told her this wasn't just a random sighting. Determined to understand the situation better, she reached for her radio and called for assistance from the local wildlife department. 30 minutes later, a dusty green truck pulled up to the roadside. Dr. Evan Carter, a seasoned wildlife biologist with years of field experience, stepped out, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat against the afternoon sun. His sharp gaze immediately locked onto the bobcat. Without hesitation, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked toward Officer Winters, his brow furrowed with concern. This is unusual, he muttered, watching the animal's restless movements. Bobcats are notoriously shy. They avoid humans whenever possible. If this one is lingering here, something's off. Winters nodded. That's what I thought too. It's like she's waiting for us to notice her. Dr. Carter crouched low, his expert eyes scanning the animal carefully. That's when he spotted it, a small, barely visible tracking collar buried in the thick fur around its neck. His expression shifted from curiosity to realization. She's tagged, he murmured. Pulling a tablet from his bag, he quickly accessed the wildlife tracking database. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen as he searched for the identification number on the collar. After a few tense seconds, he found the information he was looking for. This is Nova, he announced, his voice carrying both excitement and urgency. She's part of a research project monitoring local wildlife migration. We've been tracking her movements for months now. Winters arched an eyebrow. And does Nova usually block highways and stare down officers? She asked, half joking but still uneasy about the bobcat's behavior. Dr. Carter shook his head. Not at all. In fact, she should be miles from here, deep in the forest. If she's acting like this, it's not random. She's trying to tell us something. Winters glanced at the bobcat again, her instincts telling her to trust the animal. Nova's body was tense, her ears flicking backward every few seconds as if she were listening for something deep in the woods. All right, Winters said, tightening her grip on her flashlight and radio. Then let's find out what she wants us to see. Officer Winter's pulse quickened as she watched the bobcat's behavior shift from restless pacing to deliberate movement toward the dense forest. Nova let out a guttural growl, low and urgent, before stepping forward, then turning back, golden eyes locking onto Winters. It wasn't just random agitation, Nova was trying to tell them something. Dr. Carter, who had been studying the bobcat's body language closely, furrowed his brow. She's not just acting strange. She's leading us. His voice held a mixture of awe and concern. Winter's mind raced. The missing persons report from 2 days ago flashed in her memory. Robert Hayes, an experienced hiker, had set out on a routine weekend trek and never returned. Search teams had combed the area tirelessly, but so far, no signs of him had turned up. Could it be possible that Nova had found him? A chill ran down Winter's spine as she pulled out her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Winters. I have a situation. I believe I may have a lead on the missing hiker. Requesting immediate backup at my location." The radio crackled before a voice responded. "Copy that, Officer Winters. Search and rescue team en route." Meanwhile, Dr. Carter was scrolling through his tablet, his face growing more serious by the second. "You need to see this," he said, turning the screen toward her. It displayed a digital map tracking Nova's movements over the past 24 hours. The pattern was erratic yet telling. She had been circling a particular area deep in the forest, pausing, retracing her steps, and lingering for extended periods. "That spot right there," Carter said, pointing at the marked location. "It's near one of the main hiking trails. If Robert is out there, injured or stranded, this could be where he is." Winters inhaled sharply, her grip tightening around her flashlight. The implications were staggering. If Nova had been trying to get human attention, it meant Robert was in trouble and time was running out. She turned back toward the bobcat, who was still poised at the edge of the trees, her tail flicking impatiently, ears pricked forward in anticipation. Nova let out another soft growl, then took a few steps deeper into the woods. Winters exchanged one last glance with Dr. Carter before nodding resolutely. "All right," she said, heart pounding. "We follow her." The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Officer Sarah Winters moved carefully through the underbrush, her boots crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. The setting sun painted the treetops in hues of amber and crimson, but beneath the canopy, shadows stretched long and deep. Despite the fading daylight, Winters remained focused, her gaze locked onto the bobcat ahead of her. Nova, the wild feline, padded forward with a quiet confidence that both intrigued and unsettled Winters. The animal's every movement was purposeful, her ears flicked forward, tail swaying slightly, and golden eyes scanning the path ahead. Every so often, Nova would pause, turn her head, and look back at Winters, as if making sure she was still following. Behind Winters, Dr. Mark Carter, a seasoned wildlife expert, and 2 search and rescue officers trudged carefully, their heavy boots sinking into the damp forest floor. Dr. Carter adjusted the straps of his backpack, his face tense with concentration. "You sure about this?" one of the search and rescue officers asked in a hushed voice. "We're trusting a bobcat to lead us to a man who's been missing for days." Winters didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to believe herself. Yet, there was something in the way Nova moved, something almost deliberate. Dr. Carter spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think she's leading us randomly. This bobcat has been tracked in this area for months. If Robert Hayes somehow crossed paths with her, there's a chance she remembers." Nova suddenly stopped. Her muscles tensed, her ears swiveling forward. Winters immediately halted, her heart hammering in her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. The bobcat's nose twitched as she inhaled deeply. Then, without warning, she let out a low, rumbling growl before darting forward at a quicker pace. "She's found something," Dr. Carter murmured, his eyes alight with anticipation. Winters clutched her radio tightly, glancing at the others. "Stay close. Move fast." The team pushed through the thick foliage, following Nova as she slipped between trees and over fallen logs with effortless grace. The terrain was rough, jagged roots threatened to trip them, and the forest floor sloped unevenly, but Nova never hesitated. Then, she stopped again, this time near a rocky outcrop covered in moss. Winter's breath caught as her flashlight beam swept over a motionless figure slumped against a fallen tree. "Robert," she called, racing forward. The man stirred weakly, his head rolling to the side. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his clothes were torn and dirt-streaked. One of his legs was twisted unnaturally beneath him. He blinked up at them, his voice barely a whisper. "Help!" Dr. Carter dropped to his knees beside him, already assessing his condition. "He's alive, but severely dehydrated and possibly has a broken leg." Winters immediately pressed the button on her radio. "Dispatch, we've located the missing hiker. He's injured but conscious. Requesting immediate medical evacuation." As the search team sprang into action, Winters turned, her eyes seeking out the Bobcat. Nova stood a few feet away, watching them, her tail flicking lazily. There was something eerily knowing in her gaze, something that made Winters' stomach tighten with awe. She took a step toward the animal. "You led us right to him," she murmured. Nova didn't move. She simply stared for a moment longer before turning, slipping silently back into the forest. The shadows swallowed her whole. Winters exhaled slowly, feeling a strange mix of wonder and gratitude. "Incredible," she whispered. "Robert Hayes would survive. And it was all because of a wild bobcat who, against all odds, had become an unlikely guide." The dense forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds settling in for the evening. The air was thick with anticipation as Officer Sarah Winters knelt beside Robert Hayes, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, but finding a missing person in the wilderness, injured, vulnerable, and barely clinging to consciousness, always carried a weight of urgency that no amount of training could dull. Robert's face was pale, his skin clammy, and his breath came in short, uneven gasps. His clothes were torn, dirt and scratches covering his exposed skin. He looked like he had been lost for days, and the exhaustion in his eyes confirmed as much. "Robert," Winters said firmly, gently shaking his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" A faint groan escaped his lips. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing glassy, unfocused eyes. It took him a moment, but his gaze finally met hers, filled with confusion and relief. "Water," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. Dr. Mark Carter, the rescue team's medical expert, was already pulling a water bottle from his pack. "Here, but just a little," he cautioned, tilting it carefully to Robert's lips. "Slow sips, okay?" Robert swallowed weakly, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to grab the bottle but lacked the strength. He let out a shuddering breath. "How?" Winters followed his gaze to the spot where Nova, the bobcat, had been standing moments ago. But as expected, the wild cat had disappeared into the shadows of the forest, her part in this story seemingly complete. Winters allowed herself a small, almost disbelieving smile. "You had some unexpected help," she murmured, more to herself than to Robert. Meanwhile, Jason Moore, one of the search and rescue officers, was crouched by Robert's leg, his expression tightening. "His leg's broken," he confirmed grimly, glancing up at Winters. "We'll need to splint it before we can move him." Winters didn't hesitate. She pressed the button on her radio. "Dispatch, we have located Robert Hayes. He is alive but in critical condition, broken leg, severe dehydration, possible hypothermia. Requesting immediate medevac." "Over." "Copy that, Officer Winters," came the response through the crackling static. "Helicopter en route. ETA 20 minutes. Jason and Emily, another rescue officer, wasted no time. They gathered sturdy branches and bandages from their packs, working swiftly to create a makeshift splint. As they carefully secured Robert's leg, he tensed, his face contorted in pain. A low, pained groan slipped from his lips. Winters reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. "I know it hurts," she said gently, her voice steady despite the ache of sympathy in her chest. But you're safe now. Help is coming. Robert exhaled sharply, nodding weakly. His exhaustion was evident, his body sagging against the ground as though it had given up the fight now that rescue had arrived. His lips parted as if to say something, but his voice failed him. The distant hum of helicopter blades sliced through the quiet, growing louder with each passing second. Relief surged through Winters. They had made it just in time. The team moved quickly, clearing a landing zone and lighting flares to guide the chopper. The powerful rotor wash sent leaves and dust swirling into the air as the helicopter descended. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the medics rushed out, their movements efficient and precise as they assessed Robert's condition. Within moments, they had him stabilized and carefully transferred onto a stretcher. As they lifted him toward the waiting aircraft, Robert turned his head slightly, his weary eyes finding Winters. There was gratitude in them, unspoken yet deeply felt. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roar of the helicopter. Winters gave him a reassuring nod. "Rest now. You're going home." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Robert to safety, Winters watched it disappear over the treetops. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of purple and orange. The forest, which had felt so vast and unforgiving just hours ago, now seemed almost serene. A rustling sound made her turn. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a shadow moving between the trees, quick, silent, and unmistakably feline. "Nova." She exhaled, shaking her head in wonder. It was as if the Bobcat had understood something no human could. As if she had led them here on purpose, guiding them to Robert like a silent guardian of the wild. With one last glance into the depths of the forest, Winters turned back toward her team, a new respect settling in her heart, not just for the wilderness but for the creatures that called it home. This was more than just a rescue. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most unexpected heroes walked, or prowled, on four legs. The story of Nova, the Bobcat who had seemingly guided officers to a missing hiker, quickly became a national sensation. What had started as an unusual wildlife sighting soon transformed into a tale of mystery, survival, and an unlikely connection between humans and nature. News stations picked up the story, headlines read, "Hero Bobcat saves hiker's life," and social media erupted with awe and speculation. Officer Sarah Winters, who had first noticed Nova's strange behavior, suddenly found herself in the middle of an overwhelming media frenzy. She had never considered herself someone of interest, just another officer doing her job. But now, reporters were calling non-stop, cameras flashed every time she stepped outside, and interview requests flooded her inbox. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, but she knew one thing for certain: Nova's story was worth telling. Sitting under the bright lights of a television studio, Winters recounted the moment she first saw Nova. She described the Bobcat's piercing golden eyes watching her from the edge of the trees, the way she had refused to flee like a typical wild animal, and how she had turned back repeatedly as if urging them to follow. "It wasn't just curiosity," Winters said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It felt deliberate, almost intelligent. Like she knew something we didn't." The news anchor leaned forward, captivated. "And if you hadn't followed her?" Winters hesitated before answering. She had played that scenario over and over in her head since the rescue. If she had ignored Nova, if they had assumed she was just another wild animal passing through, then Robert Hayes, the missing hiker, might never have been found. "He wouldn't have made it," she admitted, her throat tightening. "We found him barely conscious." "If we'd been any later," she trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. The footage cut to Robert Hayes, who was still recovering in the hospital. His face was pale but alive with gratitude. "I don't know why she did it," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion but steady. "I just know that she did. I owe my life to her." As the story spread, the internet took hold of it in full force. Hashtags like #NovaTheRescueBobcat and #GuardianOfTheWild trended across platforms. Artists created stunning digital portraits of Nova, depicting her as a fierce protector of the forest. Some even speculated that she might have recognized Robert from past encounters in the wilderness, though no one could say for sure. Wildlife experts chimed in, debating whether Nova's actions had been pure coincidence or something more extraordinary. Some remained skeptical, citing animal instinct as the explanation. Others, however, believed that Nova's behavior suggested a deeper awareness. Regardless of where people stood on the debate, one thing was clear: Nova's story was inspiring change. Conservation groups saw a surge in donations, people began discussing the importance of protecting wildlife, and Nova herself became a symbol of the mysterious and often unrecognized intelligence of the natural world. For Officer Winters, the experience left her with a new sense of respect for the creatures she had spent her career protecting. And for Robert Hayes, it was a second chance at life, one he never would have had without a wild bobcat who, against all odds, refused to leave him behind. Nova's story spread like wildfire. What had begun as a simple sighting of a bobcat blocking traffic had transformed into a tale of survival, intelligence, and an unexplainable connection between humans and wildlife. News outlets, social media influencers, and wildlife conservation groups picked up the story, turning Nova into an overnight sensation. The public was captivated by the idea of a wild bobcat leading officers to a missing hiker, something that felt almost mythical. As the story gained momentum, conservation organizations saw an opportunity. The state's Wildlife Conservation Agency, along with several nonprofits, launched a campaign featuring Nova as a symbol of the importance of wildlife preservation. Her sleek form and piercing golden eyes graced posters, online advertisements, and educational materials. A documentary titled Nova, the Guardian of the Wild was produced, featuring breathtaking footage of her roaming her natural habitat, her muscles rippling beneath her spotted coat as she moved with silent grace through the underbrush. Officer Sarah Winters, who had been the first to follow Nova that fateful day, found herself in an unfamiliar spotlight. Though she had spent years on the force handling emergencies, giving interviews and speaking at public events was a different challenge altogether. She stood before an eager crowd at a wildlife conservation event, her uniform crisp but her nerves buzzing beneath it. A massive screen behind her displayed a stunning image of Nova, captured by motion-activated cameras set up by conservationists. "When I first saw Nova that morning," she began, her voice steady but thoughtful, "I thought she was just another wild animal, out of place in the middle of the road. I never expected her to lead me to a missing hiker. Some people might say it was pure coincidence. Maybe it was. But I believe there was something more at work, something that reminds us how deeply connected we are to the natural world." The audience sat in captivated silence, nodding along as she spoke about the importance of respecting wildlife and preserving their natural habitats. Meanwhile, Nova remained blissfully unaware of her newfound fame. She continued to roam her territory, her sharp instincts guiding her through the dense forests and rocky terrain. Though many people longed to catch a glimpse of her in the wild, conservationists made it clear that she was to remain undisturbed. Instead, wildlife experts installed trail cameras that captured glimpses of her life, Nova stretching beneath the golden light of dawn, her ears twitching at the sound of rustling leaves, her piercing gaze locking onto an unseen prey. These images were shared online, allowing people to admire her without intruding on her world. Robert Hayes, the man whose life Nova had helped save, became deeply involved in wildlife conservation. He had once been just another hiker, unaware of how vulnerable he was until he found himself lost and near death. Now, he dedicated his time and resources to helping preserve the very wilderness that had nearly claimed his life. He donated to wildlife programs, volunteered for trail maintenance projects, and even spoke at events, sharing his experience with others. "I wouldn't be standing here today if not for Nova," he admitted during one interview. "I owe her everything. And the best way I can repay that debt is by making sure we protect the creatures like her that call these wild places home." As the months passed, Nova's influence only grew. Schools introduced lessons about bobcats and their role in the ecosystem. Families who had once feared wild animals began to see them in a new light. The idea that humans and wildlife could coexist in harmony spread, fueled by the remarkable story of one lone bobcat who, whether by instinct or fate, had led a rescue team straight to a lost soul. And so, without ever knowing it, Nova had become more than just a bobcat. She had become a symbol of nature's wisdom, resilience, and quiet guardianship, a true wildlife ambassador, forever changing the way people saw the wild world around them. Nova's story did more than capture the public's imagination, it ignited a deep conversation about the importance of wildlife conservation. What had begun as an unusual encounter between a bobcat and a police officer soon transformed into a national discussion on the role of wildlife in human society. People were fascinated by how a wild animal, often perceived as reclusive and indifferent to human affairs, had inadvertently led rescuers to a missing man. The sheer uniqueness of the event made headlines across the country, stirring emotions and sparking debates about the need to protect wild creatures and their habitats. Wildlife conservation organizations quickly seized the opportunity to bring awareness to the challenges faced by bobcats and other native species. Nova's story became a symbol of the interconnectedness between humans and nature, a reminder that the well-being of wildlife directly impacts the balance of ecosystems. Conservation groups launched new campaigns urging people to support habitat preservation efforts, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, allowing scientists to expand research on bobcat tracking, behavior, and environmental needs. For Officer Sarah Winters, the experience left a profound impact. She had always taken her role in law enforcement seriously, but she never imagined that protecting wildlife would become part of her mission. Seeing Nova in action, watching the bobcat move with purpose, leading the team to the missing hiker, had opened her eyes to the intelligence and instincts of these animals. She couldn't shake the feeling that Nova had somehow understood the urgency of the situation. Inspired by this, she began working with local conservationists, advocating for better protocols on how law enforcement should interact with wildlife. She helped implement new training programs for officers, ensuring that encounters with wild animals would be handled with care and respect rather than fear or force. Robert Hayes, the hiker Nova had helped save, also found his life transformed. Before his harrowing experience, he had always loved the outdoors, but he had never given much thought to conservation efforts. That changed the moment he learned how close he had come to death, and how a wild animal had unwittingly played a role in his survival. Grateful for his second chance, Robert dedicated himself to raising awareness about wildlife conservation. He began volunteering at local nature reserves, speaking at community events, and even partnering with conservation groups to advocate for stronger protections for endangered habitats. He wanted people to understand that the wilderness was not just a place for adventure, it was a delicate and vital ecosystem that needed to be preserved. As Nova's story continued to spread, schools began incorporating her tale into their lessons. Teachers used her story to illustrate the balance of nature, the importance of respecting wildlife, and how human actions could either harm or protect the environment. Students were captivated by the idea that a bobcat, an animal they might have once feared or ignored, had made such a difference in a human's life. Classrooms buzzed with discussions about conservation, and many children became eager to learn more about the wildlife around them. Even policymakers took notice. Inspired by Nova's impact, local and state governments began pushing for stronger wildlife protection laws. New legislation was introduced to expand protected corridors for animals like bobcats, ensuring they could roam freely without the constant threat of habitat destruction or road traffic. Laws were strengthened to prevent illegal hunting and land encroachment, and new initiatives encouraged responsible land development that took wildlife preservation into account. Perhaps the most remarkable shift, however, was in public perception. Before Nova's story, many people saw bobcats as little more than distant, mysterious creatures, or even as potential threats. But now, they saw them as essential parts of the ecosystem, creatures that deserved respect and protection. Wildlife sightings were no longer met with fear but with curiosity and admiration. People who had never considered conservation before found themselves invested in the cause, moved by the story of a bobcat who had, in her own way, become a hero. Through one extraordinary event, Nova had unknowingly changed the way people viewed the wild. She had done more than lead rescuers to a lost man, she had opened hearts, shifted perspectives, and sparked a movement. and in doing so, she had left a lasting impact on the future of wildlife conservation. Long after the dramatic rescue, Nova's presence remained deeply ingrained in the lives of those she had touched. What had once seemed like a chance encounter between a wild bobcat and a lost hiker had become something far greater, a symbol of the unseen bonds between humans and nature, a testament to the power of instinct, and an unforgettable story of survival. For Officer Sarah Winters, that night in the forest had left an undeniable mark on her. She had always believed in the importance of protecting both people and wildlife, but seeing Nova's determination firsthand had reshaped her understanding of the natural world. Every time she replayed the scene in her mind, the bobcat pausing, looking back at her, urging her forward, she felt a mix of awe and humility. How had Nova known? Was it pure instinct, or was there something deeper, an unspoken understanding between species? Determined to honor what she had learned, Officer Winters began working more closely with local conservationists. She helped launch a new initiative that trained law enforcement officers on wildlife behavior, ensuring that animals were no longer seen as mere obstacles or dangers but as potential allies in certain cases. She even spoke at public forums about her experience, using Nova's story to highlight the intelligence and value of wildlife. For Robert Hayes, the experience had been nothing short of life-changing. Before his ordeal, hiking had been nothing more than a hobby, an escape from the stress of daily life. But now, it had become something sacred. He no longer saw himself as just a visitor in the wilderness, he was part of it, responsible for its preservation. His near-death experience had forced him to rethink everything, his reliance on modern conveniences, his disconnect from the natural world, and even his own sense of purpose. If Nova hadn't intervened, he might never have been found. The thought haunted him, but it also motivated him. He began dedicating his time to wildlife conservation efforts, speaking at events, and sharing his story in the hopes of inspiring others to respect and protect the environment. He would often say, "I owe my life to a bobcat. The least I can do is help protect hers." As for Nova, she remained a creature of the wild, unaware of the profound impact she had made on the human world. She continued to roam her territory, hunting, climbing, and blending seamlessly into the dense foliage. But every so often, she was spotted by hikers or park rangers, her sleek form appearing briefly before vanishing into the trees. To some, she was just another bobcat, another fleeting shadow in the forest. But to those who knew her story, she was something more. She was a symbol of nature's mystery and power, a reminder that the lines between human and animal, instinct and reason, were not as rigid as they seemed. Some people whispered that she still watched over the land, as if ensuring that the man she had saved was safe, that the forest remained untouched. Whether it was superstition or truth, it didn't matter. Nova's presence had left an imprint not just on the people she had encountered, but on the hearts of many who had heard her story. In the years that followed, Nova's tale spread far beyond the forest. News outlets, conservation groups, and wildlife enthusiasts kept her story alive, using it to advocate for the protection of wild spaces and the creatures that inhabited them. Her impact had stretched beyond a single rescue, it had inspired a movement. For Officer Winters, for Robert Hayes, and for many others, Nova was more than just a bobcat. She was a guardian of the wilderness, a bridge between two worlds, and proof that sometimes, the most unexpected connections could be the most profound. And so, Nova remained, unseen but not forgotten, a silent force in the wild, forever tied to the humans whose lives she had changed.